They soared through the hostile skies of Europe, steel birds of prey carrying a promise of precision. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, each one a technological marvel, were the linchpins of the Allies' strategic bombing campaign. At the heart of their mission, a device shrouded in secrecy, a marvel of engineering hailed as the key to victory, the Norden Bombsight. Its intricate gears and optical lenses were supposed to guide bombs with pinpoint accuracy, turning industrial complexes, oil refineries, and rail yards into dust. It was the Allies' silver bullet, a weapon so advanced it was believed to render all previous bombing tactics obsolete. But the German generals, with a cold, analytical eye, watched the destruction from below and, with a chilling chuckle, dismissed this precision bombing as an illusion. The Norden Bombsight, for all its genius and hype, was on a path to a devastating and unexpected failure. The year is 1941. The world is a chessboard of looming conflict, and America stands on the precipice watching Europe burn. In the quiet, unassuming offices of the Norden Corporation in New York, Carl Norden, a meticulous Dutch-American engineer, is putting the finishing touches on his life's work. It is an unassuming contraption, a brass and glass box of dials and gyroscopes, yet it holds the key to a new kind of warfare. The M1 Norden Bombsight, or as it was more famously known, the Blue Ox, was a marvel of electromechanical engineering. It wasn't just a sight. It was an analog computer designed to solve the complex physics of dropping a bomb from a moving aircraft onto a moving target. Its genius lay in its gyroscopic stability. A bomber, even when buffeted by winds and anti-aircraft fire, could hold a steady, predictable course as the Norden Bombsight meticulously calculated altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and target speed. The bombardier, a figure now elevated to a position of immense importance, would peer through its optics, lock onto the target, and the bombsight would essentially fly the plane for the final moments of the bomb run, feeding corrections directly into the autopilot. The accuracy was astounding in tests. A bomb dropped from 20,000 feet could, in a perfect world, land within a 100-foot circle. It was a weapon of surgical precision, a promise that a war could be fought without indiscriminate slaughter. The United States Army Air Forces, still a nascent and untested entity, latched on to this promise with fervent belief. They saw the Norden Bombsight not just as a tool, but as a moral imperative. They would not be like the Germans, who carpet-bombed cities without regard for civilian life. They would strike with surgical precision, crippling the enemy's war machine while minimizing collateral damage. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing was born from this faith. It was a radical departure from the British Royal Air Force's RAF strategy of nighttime area bombing, a tactic born of necessity and a grim recognition that accurate targeting at night was nearly impossible. The Americans, with their shiny new Norden bombsights, believed they had found a better way. They believed they had the technology to win the war from the sky, to dismantle the Nazi war machine piece by piece, factory by factory. The crews of the B-17s, the iconic flying fortresses, were trained with almost religious devotion to the Norden. The bombsight was treated with a reverence bordering on superstition. It was a classified secret of the highest order. Bombardiers were sworn to an oath of secrecy. The bombsight itself was guarded with armed men on the ground. When in the air, a thermite incendiary device was installed, ready to be triggered to destroy the bombsight rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting the Norden as the war-winning weapon, an infallible eye that could pierce through the chaos of war and deliver justice with unerring accuracy. The myth of the Norden bombsight was born, a myth of American ingenuity and technological superiority. But myths, by their very nature, are often a distortion of reality. The first combat missions over Europe in 1942 and early 1943 began to reveal the chasm between the laboratory and the battlefield. The clean, controlled environment of a training range was a world away from the flak-filled skies over Germany. The reality of combat was a brutal and chaotic affair. German fighter pilots, skilled and ruthless, tore through bomber formations. The winds at high altitude were not the gentle breezes of a training flight, but violent, unpredictable gales. And most critically, the weather over Europe, particularly northern Europe, was a constant, impenetrable shroud of clouds. The bombardiers, trained to spot their targets with the naked eye, found themselves peering into a featureless gray void. The Norden, for all its computational brilliance, was useless without a clear line of sight. It was a brilliant tool for a job that could rarely be performed. The initial bombing raids were a grim revelation. Bombs fell, not on factories and rail yards, but on open fields and civilian neighborhoods. The accuracy, promised to be within 100 feet, was often measured in miles. The American crews, brave and committed, were flying into a slaughter. They were losing planes and men at an alarming rate. And for what? The targets they were meant to destroy remained largely intact. The German generals, peering at the post-raid photographs, began to form their own chilling conclusion. They saw scattered craters, damaged but not destroyed industrial plants, and realized that the American promise of precision was a sham. The propaganda, so effective in America, was met with a cynical amusement in the German high command. The very weapon the Allies believed would win them the war was, in their eyes, little more than an elaborate piece of junk. But the American high command, committed to their doctrine, refused to believe the evidence. They doubled down. They believed that with more training, more men, and more planes, the Norden bombsight would finally live up to its promise. They refused to admit that their grand strategy was built on a faulty premise, that the enemy was not a static target, but a living, breathing, and brutally effective opponent. The winter of 1943 was a crucible of fire and ice, a period of devastating losses that tested the American Bomber Command to its very limits. As the missions grew longer and the targets deeper inside Germany, the toll mounted. The air crews, once filled with the naive optimism of youth, were now haunted by the ghosts of their friends, their faces etched with the fatigue and fear of constant aerial combat. The belief in the Norden bombsight, once an unshakable faith, was beginning to erode. The bombardiers, the priests of this new technology, were the first to feel the weight of this disillusionment. They were the ones who saw firsthand the bombs falling not on their intended targets, but on the homes of civilians. The moral certainty that had guided their mission was beginning to unravel. They were forced to face the grim reality that their surgical strikes were, in many ways, no different from the RAF's area bombing, only with a much higher cost in American lives. The High Command, however, was deaf to these whispers of doubt. They were too invested in the myth, too deep into the strategy to turn back. They believed that the key to success was not a change in doctrine, but simply more of the same. The stage was set for the darkest chapter of the American daylight bombing campaign, a period that would test not just their strategy, but their very resolve. The German generals, watching from below, saw this stubbornness as a gift. They were confident that the American bomber fleets, with their useless bomb sites and predictable tactics, would soon be bled white and broken. They were so very wrong about one thing. The skies over Europe had become a grim arena, a chessboard where the moves were measured in lives and the pieces were made of steel and flesh. For the American bomber crews, the first half of 1943 was a period of unremitting terror. The missions were a brutal dance with death, a desperate, grinding war of attrition. The vaunted Norden bombsight, the supposed harbinger of victory, was becoming a cruel joke among the crews. They called it a piece of junk, a useless brass box, and Carl Norden's folly. The men who had been trained to believe in its infallibility were now a generation of disillusioned cynics. The reality of combat was far more complex and brutal than the training manuals had ever suggested. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a symbol of American resilience, was also a flying target. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, piloted by some of the most skilled and battle-hardened aces in the world, swarmed the bomber formations like hornets. The bombers, stripped of their escort fighters for much of the journey, were an easy and vulnerable prey. The casualty rates were staggering. A bomber crew had a better chance of not completing their tour than they did of seeing it through to the end. The German generals, for their part, were not just watching, they were actively adapting. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, saw the American daylight bombing campaign as an opportunity. He believed he could win the air war by simply bleeding the American Bomber Command dry. His pilots were given carte blanche to attack the bomber formations with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. The tally-ho was a common cry in the German cockpits as they spotted the high, predictable formations of American bombers. They developed new tactics, approaching from the front where the B-17s were most vulnerable and flying through the formations to break them apart and pick off the stragglers. The German flak batteries were becoming more and more sophisticated. The radar-guided anti-aircraft guns could put up a curtain of deadly shrapnel at altitudes the American bombers were flying. And the German generals noted with a kind of detached amusement that the American bomber formations were so tight and so predictable, they were essentially flying into a preset ambush. The much-vaunted Norden bombsight, which required a straight and level flight for several minutes to lock onto a target, was now a death sentence. To stay on target, the bomber had to fly a predictable and vulnerable path, making it an easy mark for German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The promise of precision had become a dangerous and costly illusion. The High Command in England, led by General Ira Eaker, was under immense pressure from Washington to show results. The losses were mounting, and the factories and refineries of Germany remained largely unscathed. The morale of the bomber crews was plummeting. The fear of flying the milk run over Germany, a grim joke for a mission that was anything but, was a constant, gnawing presence. The men flew with a grim fatalism, their pre-mission briefings a time of quiet dread. The German generals, with a cold, almost detached analysis, saw the futility of the American strategy. The American Bomber Command was fighting a war of attrition they could not win, using a technology that had proved to be woefully inadequate for the task. They were like a boxer with a glass jaw, willing to take punch after punch in the hopes that their opponent would eventually tire. But the Germans were not tiring. They were getting stronger. They were building a defensive infrastructure that was becoming more and more lethal. They were improving their fighter planes and their anti-aircraft systems. They were confident that it was only a matter of time before the Americans, with their useless bombs and their fragile doctrine, would be forced to abandon their daylight bombing campaign altogether. But a new player was about to enter the game, one that would turn the air war on its head. The American High Command, in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of losses, was about to introduce a new weapon, a long-range fighter that would finally give the bomber crews the protection they so desperately needed. The P-51 Mustang, a sleek and fast aircraft with an unprecedented range, was about to change the entire calculus of the air war. But the German generals, blinded by their success and their certainty, did not see the true danger coming. They believed the Americans would continue to fight their war of attrition, with predictable formations and an increasingly useless bomb sight. They were so confident in their analysis of the enemy's flawed strategy that they dismissed the new American fighter as just another piece in a losing game. They had underestimated the American capacity for innovation and adaptation. The arrival of the P-51 was a fundamental shift, a change in the rules of the game. For the bomber crews, it was a lifeline. For the German generals, it was a sudden, horrifying realization that their victory was not as certain as they had believed. They had been so focused on the flaws in the American strategy that they had failed to see the one thing that would make that strategy viable. They had dismissed the American bombers as a slow and vulnerable target, but they were about to learn a brutal and bloody lesson. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in early 1944 was a watershed moment, a silent revolution in the skies over Europe. It was a sleek, fast, and most importantly, long-range fighter. A hunter-killer designed to go deep into Germany and protect the lumbering bomber formations. For the bomber crews, the P-51 was a godsend. It was their guardian angel, their silver bullet against the onslaught of German fighters. The fighter pilots, now given the freedom to tally-ho German fighters on their own turf, were a terrifying new threat to the Luftwaffe. The air war had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a one-sided slaughter. It was a vicious two-way street. The German generals, initially dismissive of the new American fighter, were now forced to confront a brutal new reality. Their fighter pilots, once the lords of the sky, were now fighting for their lives against an equally fast and powerful opponent. The skies over Germany were now the scene of a swirling, chaotic dogfight, and the Americans, with their new fighters, were beginning to gain the upper hand. The American High Command, buoyed by the success of the P-51, doubled down on their strategy of daylight precision bombing. But even with the new fighters, the fundamental flaw in the Norden bombsight remained. The weather over Europe was still a persistent and impenetrable cloak. The bombardiers, now protected by fighter escorts, were still flying through a gray void, unable to see their targets. The bombs continued to fall with a depressing inaccuracy. The American strategic bombing campaign, for all its technological prowess and human sacrifice, was still failing to achieve its stated goals. The German generals, with a cynical eye, watched the destruction from below. They saw the American bombers, now protected by their new fighters, flying deeper and deeper into Germany. They saw the bombs falling, not on the industrial heart of the Reich, but on the fringes of cities, on open farmland, and on civilian homes. They had been wrong about the American fighter, but they were still right about the bombsight. It was still a useless piece of junk. But then, in a moment of desperate ingenuity, the American High Command began to introduce a new and radical solution to the weather problem. It was a new kind of technology, one that would change the very nature of bombing. It was called radar. The H-2X radar, a bulky and complex system, was not as accurate as the Norden bombsight in a perfect world, but it could see through clouds, through rain, through snow. It was a game changer. It allowed the Americans to bomb on days when the weather was completely overcast, on days when the Norden bombsight was nothing more than a paperweight. The American bombers, now flying with both the Norden and the H-2X, began to strike Germany with a new and terrifying regularity. They were no longer limited by the weather. They could strike any day, any time. The German generals, initially confident in their ability to predict and counter the American bombing campaign, were now faced with a new and unpredictable threat. The American bombers, once limited to clear weather days, were now a constant menace. They could no longer rely on the clouds to protect their cities and their factories. But the H-2X was not a perfect solution. It was a blunt instrument. It could not distinguish between a factory and a civilian neighborhood. It could only provide a rough outline of a city or a town. The bombs, guided by the H-2X, were no longer precision bombs. They were area bombs. The American High Command, once so committed to the idea of surgical strikes, was now forced to abandon their moral high ground. They were now fighting a war of attrition, a war of indiscriminate destruction. The Norden bombsight, once the symbol of a new and better way of fighting, was now nothing more than a secondary instrument, a tool to be used only on the rare clear days. The majority of the bombs were now being dropped by the H-2X, a technology that made no pretense of precision. The German generals, with a chilling kind of satisfaction, saw the truth of the matter. The Americans had, by their own hand, abandoned their moral imperative. They had become just like the British, just like the Germans. They were no longer fighting a war of precision. They were fighting a war of destruction. But they had also made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that the American bombing campaign, even with its new technology, would be a predictable and containable threat. They had not yet seen the full and terrible power of the American industrial machine, the relentless and unceasing stream of new bombers, new fighters, and new bombs. The American High Command, now armed with the H-2X and the P-51, was about to unleash a storm of destruction that the German generals had not yet fully comprehended. The skies were about to rain fire, and the German generals were about to learn that even a useless bomb, when multiplied by the thousands, can be a weapon of unimaginable power. The year 1944 was a maelstrom of destruction, a relentless storm of fire and steel that descended upon Germany from the sky. With the P-51 Mustangs now controlling the skies and the H-2X radar allowing for all-weather bombing, the American strategic bombing campaign shifted into a new and terrifying gear. The pretense of precision was largely dropped. The Norden bombsight, once a symbol of a moral and technological superiority, was now relegated to a secondary role, used only when a rare break in the clouds allowed for a glimpse of the target. The majority of the missions were now blind raids, with bombs dropped through the clouds using the H-2X radar. The German generals, who had once sneered at the Americans' useless bombsight, were now faced with a relentless and unceasing threat. The American bombers, no longer limited by the weather, were striking targets day and night, in sunshine and in rain. The industrial heart of Germany, the factories, the oil refineries, the rail yards, were now being subjected to a constant barrage of bombs. But the German generals, with their cold, analytical minds, saw the new reality for what it was. The American bombing campaign was no longer surgical. It was a bludgeon. It was a war of area bombing, of indiscriminate destruction. The Germans had, for years, suffered under the British nighttime area bombing, but the Americans had now joined the fray, bringing with them a vast and inexhaustible supply of planes and bombs. The German propaganda machine, which had once mocked the Americans' futile attempts at precision, now shifted its tone. It spoke of the American terror bombers, of the Anglo-American murderers who were killing innocent civilians. The German generals, for all their strategic brilliance, had failed to grasp the true nature of the American war machine. They had seen the flaws in the American strategy and had concluded that it was a losing game. They had underestimated the American capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to simply overwhelm the enemy with a sheer volume of force. They had focused on the how of the American bombing campaign and had failed to grasp the what. The what was simple. The Americans were going to bomb Germany until there was nothing left to bomb. They were going to destroy the German industrial infrastructure, not with pinpoint accuracy, but with overwhelming force. The Norden bombsight, for all its technological brilliance, was a symbol of a strategy that had failed. But the American High Command, with a pragmatism born of a desperate war, had moved on. They had found a new way to fight, a new way to win. The H-2X radar was not as accurate as the Norden, but it was accurate enough. It was accurate enough to hit a city, to hit a factory, to hit a rail yard. It was accurate enough to turn the German industrial war machine into a smoking ruin. The German generals, in their post-war memoirs, would speak of the useless bombs of the American Air Force. They would talk about the Americans' obsession with a precision bombing that was, in their eyes, a myth. They would speak of the Americans' failure to destroy the German war machine with a surgical strike. But they would also admit, in private and in public, that the American bombing campaign, in its sheer scale and relentlessness, had been a decisive factor in the war. The American air campaign, for all its flaws and its immense cost in lives, had succeeded in its ultimate goal. It had crippled the German war machine. The German generals, who had once laughed at the Americans' useless bombs, were now faced with a truth that was anything but funny. The bombs, whether they were guided by the Norden or the H-2X, had done their job. They had destroyed the German factories, the oil refineries, the rail yards. They had turned the German war economy into a smoking ruin. And in doing so, they had sealed Germany's fate. But a new and even more terrifying chapter of the air war was about to begin. One that would make the bombing of Germany seem almost quaint in its scale and horror. The Americans, now masters of the sky, were about to unleash a new kind of weapon, a new kind of bomb that would change the nature of warfare forever. The German generals, still reeling from the destruction of their own country, had no idea that the American Air Force was about to turn its attention to another enemy and to another kind of warfare entirely. The final act of the war in Europe was a symphony of destruction, and the American bombers, now an unstoppable force, played a leading role. The German generals, their country in ruins, were forced to admit that the American bombing campaign, for all its lack of precision, had been a decisive factor in their defeat. The myth of the Norden bombsight was dead, replaced by the grim reality of H-2X radar-guided area bombing. The American High Command had learned a brutal lesson. Winning a war is not always about precision. It is sometimes about overwhelming force. But as the war in Europe drew to a close, a new and even more terrifying chapter of the air war was about to begin in the Pacific. The Americans, now with a vast and battle-hardened air force, turned their attention to Japan. The strategy was the same: destroy the enemy's industrial capacity from the air. But the conditions were completely different. The Japanese air defenses, while formidable, were not as advanced as the Germans. And the weather over Japan, while often cloudy, was not as consistently hostile as the weather over Europe. The American Bomber Command, now flying the new and even more formidable B-29 Superfortress, believed that they could finally achieve the kind of precision bombing that had eluded them in Europe. The B-29 was a technological marvel, a pressurized high-altitude bomber with a range and speed that were unprecedented. It was a perfect platform for the Norden bombsight, a chance to finally prove its worth. But the Japanese, with their vast and dispersed industrial base, were not an easy target. The factories were often small and scattered throughout the cities, and the workers lived and worked in close proximity. The American High Command, for all its talk of precision, soon realized that a true surgical strike was impossible. The bombs, dropped from 30,000 feet, often missed their mark, and the Japanese war effort continued to chug along. The American High Command, once again faced with the grim reality of a war that was not going as planned, made a radical and terrible decision. They would abandon the high-altitude, daylight precision bombing in favor of a new kind of warfare: low-altitude, nighttime incendiary bombing. The B-29s, once so proud of their high-altitude capability, would now fly at low altitudes under the cover of darkness and drop not high-explosive bombs, but firebombs. The first firebombing raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, was a scene of apocalyptic horror. The B-29s, flying at an altitude of just a few thousand feet, rained down a torrent of incendiary bombs on the crowded wooden cities of Japan. The resulting firestorm was a hellish inferno, a swirling vortex of heat and flame that consumed everything in its path. The firestorm, with winds of over 100 miles per hour, sucked the air from the lungs of the people on the ground and incinerated everything, including the people themselves. The raid on Tokyo killed over 100,000 people, more than the initial death toll of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It was a brutal and indiscriminate act of war, a far cry from the surgical strikes the American High Command had once promised. The German generals, still reeling from their own defeat, watched from afar with a kind of grim fascination. They saw the Americans' campaign against Japan for what it was: an unvarnished, brutal war of annihilation. The pretense of precision had been completely abandoned. The Norden bombsight, the very symbol of American technological superiority, was now nothing more than an anachronism, a relic of a failed strategy. The American High Command, in their desperate and relentless pursuit of victory, had embraced a kind of total war that made the German generals' own tactics seem almost restrained by comparison. They had learned that in a total war, there is no such thing as a useless bomb, as long as there are enough of them to get the job done. The German generals, in their post-war analysis, would marvel at the Americans' capacity for innovation and adaptation, but they would also speak with a kind of grim satisfaction about the Americans' abandonment of their own moral high ground. The Americans had, by their own hand, turned themselves into the very thing they had once claimed to be fighting against. But the war was not yet over, and the American High Command was about to unleash a new and even more terrifying kind of bomb, one that would make the firebombing of Tokyo seem almost like a prelude to a greater horror. The world was about to enter a new and terrifying age, and the Norden bombsight, with all its promises of precision, was about to be rendered obsolete in a way that no one could have ever predicted. The final chapter of the Second World War was written in the skies over Japan, and the American bombers, now armed with a new and terrible weapon, delivered the final, decisive blow. The Norden bombsight, for all its promise and its ultimate failure, had been the symbol of an era of warfare that was about to be rendered obsolete by a new kind of bomb. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were not dropped with the Norden bombsight. They were dropped from a B-29, but the targeting was done by a new kind of bombsight, a simplified version of the Norden called the ANA-11. The bombs themselves were not precision weapons. They were weapons of total destruction, designed to annihilate an entire city in a single blinding flash. The promise of the Norden bombsight, the promise of a surgical strike, of a war fought without indiscriminate slaughter, was now a cruel and tragic irony. The American Air Force, which had started the war with a doctrine of pinpoint accuracy, was now ending it with a weapon of unimaginable power and destruction. The German generals in their post-war confinement watched the news of the atomic bombings with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. They had been right. The Americans' useless bombs had turned into something far more terrible, The Americans' obsession with precision had been a myth, a moral smokescreen for a war that had always been about destruction. The Norden bombsight, once the pride of the American war machine, was now a relic of a bygone era, a symbol of a failed promise. It was a beautiful, intricate piece of engineering, a marvel of its time, but it had been rendered obsolete not by a better bombsight, but by a better bomb. The war had changed. The rules had changed. The very nature of conflict had been fundamentally altered. The Norden bombsight, with all its gears and gyroscopes, was a symbol of a war that was fought with a kind of moral pretense, a war of surgical strikes and technological superiority. But the atomic bomb was a symbol of a new kind of war, a war of annihilation, a war where the only thing that mattered was not precision, but power. The German generals had been right all along. The Americans' bombs had been useless for their stated purpose, but they had not been useless in their ultimate effect. They had been instruments of a slow, grinding, and ultimately devastating victory. The American Air Force, with its B-17s and its Norden bombsights, had failed to win the war with precision, but they had succeeded in winning it with a relentless and unceasing storm of destruction. And in the end, that's all that mattered. The legacy of the Norden bombsight is a complex and tragic one. It is a story of a brilliant piece of technology that was a victim of its own hype, a story of a military doctrine that was built on a faulty premise, and a story of a war that was far more brutal and complex than anyone could have ever imagined. It is a story of a weapon that was hailed as a key to victory, but was ultimately a symbol of a campaign that, for all its sacrifice and heroism, was a testament to the brutal and indiscriminate nature of modern warfare. And in the end, the German generals, with their cynical laughter, had been the only ones who had seen the truth all along. The Americans' useless bombs were not useless at all. They were just not the kind of bombs the Americans had claimed they were. And the final, terrible lesson of the war was that in a conflict of this scale, the pretense of precision is a luxury that no one can afford. The skies were now silent, the war was over, but the echoes of the Norden bombsight and the truth of its failure would forever be a haunting reminder of the brutal reality of total war.